Greetings. My name is Hunter Maples, and today we will be discussing the Huguenot experience in the American colonies prior to the Revolution. More specifically, we will be looking at the motivations for their assimilation into English American culture. As we will discover, the Huguenots that migrated to the American colonies did not maintain their culture, language, or even their religious practices and cohesion. There are many factors that played into their assimilation, which will be the primary focus of our study. Before we dive into the experience of the Huguenots, we need to first discuss who they were. Once that has been established, we can then examine the significant locales in which they congregated once they left their homeland. Finally, based on the information provided by the first two questions, we can begin to look at why there seems to be no remnant of Huguenot settlement and culture in modern America, even if you look at American culture almost immediately after the Revolution. Were the Huguenots forced into conformity against their collective will? Did they leave one place of persecution only to find opposition in their country of refuge? Or was their assimilation voluntary? If so, what factors can make not only a cultural and ethnic group, but a religious cohort abandon their beliefs and practices? First, we must establish a working definition of who the Huguenots were. They originated in 16th century France, which was predominantly Catholic. This created a problem for them as they were Protestants. More specifically, most Huguenots followed the teachings of John Calvin, a Geneva, Switzerland minister who was the founder of the Calvinist stream of faith. Calvin was an early French Protestant refugee himself, although it would be anachronistic to label him a Huguenot. The French Protestants saw great persecution in their home country, essentially from when they began to be seen as dissenters, because of their difference in belief from the Catholic majority. The persecution in some places turned to violence between Catholics and militant Protestants. This all culminated into the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when thousands of Protestants were killed both in Paris and in the countryside. The Edict of Nantes was declared in 1598. It gave certain, although restrictive, permissions to the French Protestants to worship and conduct their business throughout their homeland. It was declared by one of France's only Protestant kings, Henry IV, who is pictured here, and brought an end to the French wars of religion. The honeymoon was short-lived, as King Louis XIV, a staunch Catholic, revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685 in the Edict of Fontainebleau. This revocation once again made Protestantism illegal in the country and increased the frequency and severity of persecution of the Huguenots. Nearly unbearable conditions made it difficult for French Protestants to not only do business in France, but also to survive. When the Huguenots first began to leave France decades earlier, they intended to create an almost utopian community of religious toleration in Europe, probably not too different from what the Quakers attempted in Pennsylvania. Reality did not allow for such a creation, but they settled in many places throughout Europe and the world. These included the Netherlands, England, Germany, South Africa, and the British American colonies. The French Protestants that settled in the British American colonies primarily did so in three regions, these being New England, primarily in the Boston area, New York, and South Carolina. There is almost no way of knowing exactly how many Huguenots settled in each of these places. There are tax records which reveal French surnames, but we can't be certain that they were all French Protestants. Additionally, the manner in which the British tax system worked in the colonies left out the lowest economic tier of colonists, which many Huguenots were likely a part of. These will be the locations at the center of our study as we attempt to discover how and why the French Protestants assimilated into English American culture. The first locale of Huguenot relocation we will examine is New England, or more specifically Boston. There were multiple French Protestant settlements throughout New England originally, but none of them besides Boston perpetuated into the 1690s. Even though the refugees that had arrived there found themselves in an overwhelmingly English-majority city, more affluent French Protestants quickly rose through the ranks of society. In the first decade of the 18th century, 4 prominent Huguenots were elected as city constables, most notably André Finial, the father of the financier of Faneuil Hall. Their involvement in city politics only increased over time, but we will discuss more about their political activities when we discuss their assimilation. If marriage records are any indication, it is evident that they did not live in a cohesive, centralized community, but were distributed throughout the English population. There were multiple French churches throughout New England that were established shortly after the arrival of the refugees. By 1696, however, the congregation in Boston was the only one that remained in New England. The church saw a handful of ministers cycle through its pulpit, which was located in a schoolhouse rented by the congregation. Eventually, one minister was able to convince the wealthier congregants to contribute to the construction of a building which provided a house of worship for several decades. This church was disbanded and sold in 1748 when there was not enough energy or finances from its congregants to sustain it. The rationale behind its closure is the topic we will investigate next. On the surface, the saturation of the Huguenots in the largely English population of Boston leads one to believe that that was the cause of their assimilation. Upon further investigation, it appears that the Englishman to Huguenot ratio only served to welcome the refugees that left the culture, language, and religion of their French beginnings. It could be argued that being surrounded by a foreign population could have driven the Huguenots together into a stronger, more cohesive community. Rather than blaming the immersion of the Huguenots in English culture, there are other more likely rationales for their assimilation. The first of these would be their splintering from the French Calvinist church congregation in Boston. Again, being smothered by a predominantly Anglican society could be blamed, but as we will see, there were plenty of internal reasons for their departure. The 1690s were a particularly rough time for Boston Huguenots. Robert Kingdon, in his article discussing the abandonment of traditional French Calvinism, sheds light on the political situation prior to and during the arrival of the Huguenots in the 1680s. Recent legal changes removed the privilege of Massachusetts colonists to elect their own governor. The governor was to be appointed by the crown. This had severe repercussions in the colonies' churches, as more rights and privileges were granted to Episcopalian churches rather than Congregationalist churches. Divisions between French Calvinist ministers and disputes over their salaries brought a series of ministers to the French church, none of them staying long enough to establish a viable ministry, and often prompted their defection to Anglicanism. It is also argued that the kindness experienced by much of the refugees from their English neighbors eventually converted them to Anglicanism. Whatever the reason, or probably a conglomeration of all of these, Huguenots left the congregation of their original belief and joined other denominations, usually King's Chapel, the largest Episcopal church in Boston at the time. This is supported from evidence provided in the marriage records of the Episcopal Church. This leads us into the next factor that contributed to the Huguenot assimilation in New England. Exogamy, or in our case, the marriage of French Protestants to members of other ethnicities or faiths, can be seen as both an indicator of and a contributor to the disappearance of the Huguenots. In most cases, when French refugees married outside of their community, it was to English partners. There are a few cases in which Huguenots married Dutch settlers of Boston, but most contain French and English partners. All of these marriages are revealed to us through the marriage records of, not the French church, but the Episcopal Church, which further indicates that there was conversion from one church to the other. According to John Butler's research into these records, from 1700 to 1715, there were 43 Huguenot marriages. 5 were performed by the French minister, and 3 out of these 5 involved French grooms taking English brides. Out of the 38 other Huguenot marriages, mostly performed by none other than Cotton Mather, only 7 involved both spouses being French. The most significant part of the latter is that an English minister married more French couples than the French minister. These numbers only become more drastic after 1715. There is also evidence that some French refugee families, including the Finials, were involved in both the French Calvinist and the Episcopalian denominations concurrently. In order for 2 members of different denominations and ethnic groups to marry, there must be at least some significant public interaction between the 2 communities. The political involvement of the French Huguenots in Boston society demonstrates that this was especially common. An early 1700s election was mentioned earlier, which involved 4 prominent Huguenots being elected as city constables. By 1750, this number grew to 28. It is clear that the English residents of the colony of Massachusetts grew to like the French refugees enough to elect them to civil office. Eventually, all of these factors were too much to bear for the French church. In 1748, the church building was sold to an up-and-coming congregation that was sparked by a visit from George Whitefield to Boston. The demise of the church was blamed by the elders not on dwindling numbers, but by the failure of the congregation's final minister, André Le Messier, who himself blamed it on the failure of the Huguenots to propagate the use of the French language, which has little evidence as a contributor. Ironically, 40 years after the sale of the building, it was again sold to Irish immigrants, who established Boston's first Catholic church. Those that belonged to the group that first persecuted the Huguenots and prompted their settlement in New England worshipped in their building after 1788. If you look at New York City today, you will see a vibrant metropolitan area of multiple ethnic groups that have created distinct, cohesive communities. Absent from the handful of ethnic groups represented is that of the French Protestants that settled there. Their culture has disappeared from New York society. When the French refugees arrived in New York, they were widely welcomed into political involvement. Once the Huguenots were naturalized, they were granted full voting privileges. Even though they were kindly welcomed, refugees arriving in the 1680s sought to establish their own community northeast of Manhattan. This settlement became known as New Rochelle. It was a rural community based on agricultural production and attempted to preserve French culture in the New World. The New York government allowed for the Huguenots to govern their own society in New Rochelle and other smaller rural communities. The French church also thrived early on in New York. One reason for this may have been the loosening of restrictions on exogamous marriages. The Huguenots widely discouraged exogamy in their congregation, but baptism records share that children born between French and English or Dutch parents were being baptized in the French church. While the Huguenot ministers were not ordaining exogamous marriages, they were accepting multi-ethnic marriages in their congregation, which contributed to the strengthening of the church in New York. In 1687, a minister by the name of Pierre Perret arrived in New York City from Europe and energized the ministry of the French congregation. One of the members and elders of Perret's church was a merchant named Elie New. On one of his merchant voyages to London in 1692, he was captured by a French privateer that surrendered him to the French authorities, who placed him in a dungeon and later the prison island of Marseille for being a Protestant and converting fellow prisoners. New was able to write letters back to New York from his prison cell that were distributed throughout both Huguenot and English communities. Cotton Mather translated one of his letters for English readers. This personal example of continued Protestant persecution contributed to a resurgence of the French Calvinist Church in New York. While it seems as though the Huguenots had established themselves as a society that would persist throughout the coming decades, there were circumstances that would negatively affect their perpetuation. Even in the exciting energy of early successes, there was still a widening disparity between the economic classes among French refugees. Many of the early arrivals were well-to-do French merchants that fit well into New York maritime society and were able to continue their success with lasting merchant connections in Europe. As we have discussed prior, the tax records of the British colonies probably do not give a full picture of the economic situation of most Huguenots. It is likely that the widening gap between rich and poor Huguenots contributed to division among the community. The gap didn't begin to close until well into the 1700s. While many Huguenots participated in maritime occupations in New York, there was a large-scale departure from this trade after 1710. French refugees, or their children, were more likely to join trades that did not match those of their parents. From merchant occupations, the second generation of Huguenots migrated toward government work, retail, crafts and services, or commerce. This shift in occupation matched the employment needs of New York City in the first decades of the 18th century. Here we see Huguenots adjusting to what was required of them by their host country as they removed themselves from their French culture and old world ways of life. Much like the case in New England, exogamy was widespread in New York. The marriage of Huguenots to English and Dutch spouses probably contributed to their assimilation, but it certainly indicates to us their integration into English society. Prior to 1710, New York does serve as a special case because exogamous relationships were tolerated in the French church, but this toleration likely dissolved in subsequent decades. Probably the most indiscreet factor of Huguenot assimilation in New York was the disintegration of the once surging French church. The invaluable minister Pierre Perret unexpectedly passed away in 1704. In the absence of their effective leadership, the French congregation saw a great migration to Anglicanism. First and foremost, this was caused by internal mismanagement of church affairs. The congregation suffered through multiple vagrant ministers that filtered through the pulpit without establishing any effective ministry. Church elders factionalized around these visiting ministers, which led to quarreling. Their persecuted hero, Elie New, now released from prison and back in the colonies, converted to Anglicanism, which only placed more momentum behind the tidal wave of abandonment seen by the French church. By the time you arrive at the American Revolution in the 1770s, the only remnant of New York City's and New Rochelle's Huguenot presence were the French surnames of Anglican adherents. There seemed to be hope for New York's French Protestant culture to be promulgated in the colony, but with the loss of excellent leadership, the whole began to leak, and ultimately the distinct cultural identity sank into the wider English New York population. Historian R.C. Nash argued that the area that has seen the most influence from Huguenot settlement was the South Carolina region. The Huguenots first arrived when the South Carolina economy, centered around Charlestown, was blooming. This allowed them to get in on the ground floor, so to speak, and find great economic success. They were originally drawn to South Carolina by the pamphlets that were sent to Europe to draw European settlers. These pamphlets often left out the excruciating heat and humidity of Charlestown in the summer months and conjured images of land allotments that were figurative gold mines. Once the Huguenots arrived, they made their living in ways that are different than the French settlers of New York and New England. Rather than continue their legacy of maritime trade, South Carolina settlers took on mainly agricultural ventures as well as work as skilled craftsmen. Many refugees left linen works in their homeland and continued to work in textiles in South Carolina, as well as work as cobblers and tailors. Others found their take in agriculture. One of the most popular ventures for settling refugees was silk, which is the product many of them left in Europe. When we look at the allotments allowed to the Huguenots by the colonial government, they stand in stark contrast to that of their northern counterparts. The South Carolina Huguenots averaged 710 acres per family, compared to 150 acres, which was the usual allotment to farmers in New England. A total of 104,000 acres of land was given to French Protestant refugees in the colony. In order to work these large tracts of land, Huguenots adopted the use of African slaves. South Carolina adopted the system of slavery from the West Indies and thus became the region with the largest concentration of slaves anywhere in North America. Huguenots were quick to adopt the plantation system on their estates. While the propagation of slavery in the colonies has caused many issues for many generations, as well as for French families, it does indicate that they found economic success in their new home. Finally, a more lighthearted indicator of their adjustment to South Carolina culture and economy, Charlestown's first portraitist was a Huguenot. Henrietta Johnson's career also indicates that Huguenots were introducing themselves to the South Carolina elite, as a third of her portraits are of French Protestants. Even though the Huguenots made their entrance into the South Carolina elite society, the distinction of their French heritage wouldn't last any longer than it did elsewhere. In fact, by 1750 it was nearly non-existent. One of the first factors that contributed to their assimilation were the political struggles they faced upon first settling in the colony. Until 1710, Huguenots were, while not officially, effectively prohibited from serving in the Colonial Assembly of South Carolina. This created problems as Huguenots made up anywhere from 10 to 15% of the colony's white population. While they made up a large plurality of the population, prejudice from English settlers made it very difficult for them to be represented. In efforts to keep them from being represented, English lawmakers created election districts rather than using a single county system. They also did not claim the legitimacy of any French Protestant church, saying all marriages ordained there were illegitimate and the children produced were illegitimate as well. Royal efforts to change these policies and views, such as switching to a single county voting system and allowing Huguenots the right to vote, only grew the English disdain for French settlers. The Huguenots sacrificed much of their culture and French heritage for political gain in the colony. While the large land allotments and the number of slaves held by refugees speak to their economic success in the colony, there are also factors in their assimilation. As the French settlers took on more land to cultivate and more slaves to work said land, they began to look more like their English counterparts in South Carolina. They abandoned the products that they knew in their French homeland, such as wine and silk, to cultivate rice, tobacco, and other cash crops. Along with this transition, French settlers also abandoned the method in which they farmed in France, New England, and New York. They turned to slavery rather than continue the practice of family farming. Finally, there were religious factors to the assimilation of the Huguenots. Most of the trends that lent to the crumbling of the French church followed those of an economic or political nature. The French church promoted cooperation between French Calvinists and the Anglican denomination in order to repel any semblance of Catholicism in the colony. This probably stemmed from personal connections between the Anglican and Huguenot ministers of the city. All of this came to a head in 1706 when the South Carolina Church Act was passed, which made the Church of England the official church in the land. Many French representatives are recorded as supporting the act to inhibit the growth of the Catholic Church. Interestingly, little is recorded about the actual threat to the Protestant way of worship in the colony. Nevertheless, the joining together of French Protestants and Anglicans ultimately was the last nail in the coffin for French church cohesion. This is supported by more evidence in marriage records that mirror those of New England and New York. The French church building in Charleston would remain standing and would welcome George Whitefield in 1740. This building stood, likely altogether unused, until 1796 when it was demolished to prevent the spread of a great fire away from the city's valuable fishing works. The remnant of the original French settlers continued to rebuild churches like the one seen here, which was built in 1845. These were mostly built as memorial churches where the revocation of the Edict of Nantes is still celebrated every year in October. There has not been an active ministry taking place there for nearly 300 years. So as we have seen, there are multiple factors that contributed to the assimilation of the Huguenots into the English-American culture in the American colonies. The most widespread and blatant contributor was the intermarriage of the French Protestants with the English and Dutch settlers that preceded them. This is seen wherever the refugees settled. Huguenots from a wide spectrum of economic classes came to the New World. The widening disparity created division in their community. Huguenots left occupations grounded in their French heritage to pursue more lucrative ventures, which weakened their distinct culture. The southern refugees adopted the use of slavery, which did two things. It made them more similar to their English counterparts in the region, and took them from an oppressed, persecuted group, which might have provided some cohesion, and joined them with the dominant class, particularly in the South Carolina colony. The French settlers strived to establish themselves in colonial politics. This required them to sacrifice their French culture and become effectively homogenous with their English neighbors. In order to pull votes for themselves, it was necessary that they appeal to the majority of voters who were English. Finally, the primary body which would have held the Huguenots together was their adherence to the French Church. It was religious persecution that brought them to the New World. Once they arrived on the shores of America, they somewhat quickly abandoned their faith and joined Anglican congregations. They found themselves following the mainstream of religious practice in the colonies. Now, it wasn't necessarily due to their lack of loyalty. The French Church suffered from inconsistent leadership in most places. There are a few exceptions, such as Pierre Perret, but for the most part, French congregations struggled to maintain a consistent ministry. As a result, the congregations and their elders found themselves in disputes that weakened religious cohesion. The Huguenots also failed to establish a national church or leadership. The final nail in the coffin for most Huguenot communities was the closing of their church doors. It would be beneficial to step back and look at the Huguenot community prior to their arrival in America. What we will find will provide more answers to the question of why the refugees were so quick to abandon their culture, language, heritage, and religion. In the revocation of the Edict of Nantes that initiated the migration of most of the French Protestants, Louis XIV officially condoned the destruction of any business or industry that was established by those that worship apart from the Catholic Church. This made it terribly difficult for the Huguenots to provide a living for themselves in France. Many of the Protestants were involved in quite lucrative industries such as trade or winemaking. The Huguenots have often been painted as a group that left France for freedom to worship the way they pleased. If we look at the immediate commencement of their economic activities in America, it appears that the refugees might have left to continue their way of life rather than for freedom of worship. Certainly there were Huguenots that found great value in their faith, but there were many that were quick to join yet another crown-mandated denomination, the Anglican Church. Even if they were to have converted to the crown-sponsored Catholicism in France, it would have likely been very difficult to escape the negative effect of the revocation on their livelihoods. In a letter from one Huguenot writing in 1687 to a fellow Protestant back in France, the refugee in America does not mention any religious congregation or activity, but he is quick to share about the economic success that he and others had found. If this first-hand account is any indication, the Huguenots may be less relatable to the English Puritans that sought religious freedom, and more like those that came to America for economic success, and joined the predominant religious faith wherever they settled. The French Protestants that came to America did not contribute in the conventional way like their English counterparts. They did not blatantly inject their French culture into colonial American society. Instead, they conformed to the mainstream way of life and faith, which was English in nature. Because of tensions in European geopolitics, some English settlers suspected the refugees of being spies. This might have contributed to the eagerness of some Protestants to shed their Calvinist background and join the Anglican Church. They had a decision to make. In an effort to quell suspension, were they to join the Anglican Church, a crown-sponsored denomination like the one they had fled, or forge their own path? The decision most made was to join their English neighbors in the pews of Episcopal churches in the colonies. Another shift takes place when we get to the American Revolution. Historian R.C. Nash observes that the Huguenots were quick to join the cause for independence. By the time of the Revolution, they found their identity in the land that had welcomed and accepted them so kindly. They were also hesitant to take sides with the royal government that was able to impose religious restrictions like their ancestors had experienced in France. Huguenots lent their weight to support the coming of the American Revolution. These characteristics of the Huguenots in America made them, as one historian called them, the ideal immigrant. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I hope you have found it as valuable as I have to discover about a mysterious immigrant group and their relation to the history of America.